Breaking news now on CBS 2 News at 11, an active shooter situation on the Las Vegas Strip. It sounds like it began at the Route 91 Harvest Country Music Festival at the Mandalay Bay Resort Event Center in Las Vegas tonight.
Dramatic video is being posted on social media. Las Vegas PD just tweeted, "We are investigating reports of an active shooter near the Mandalay Bay Casino. We are asking everyone to please avoid that area." Right now, nothing is confirmed. Lots of varying reports about the victims and the shooters. Again, nothing confirmed at this point.
So there was a lady who pushed her way forward into the concert venue, into the first row, and she started messing with another lady and told us that we were all going to die tonight.
Do you know why she was saying that? I mean, was this after the shots were fired, or?
It was about 45 minutes before the shots were actually fired, but then she was escorted out by security.
Town full of neon dreams. Everybody plays, everybody sings. Hollywood with a touching way. To be a star, you gotta bang, bang, bang.
I welcome this kind of examination.
We came,
and for the international order that we have worked for generations to build.
A new world order.
A new world order.
we saw.
If suddenly there was a threat to this world from some other species, from another planet, outside in the universe.
Always talk to you like they're the boss.
And then we're going to Washington, D.C. to take back the White House!
He died. He died.
But that's a wicked woman.
Because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook.
You can keep it. Period. 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 They are the focus of evil in the modern world. It's a catastrophe.
Deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome.
This is the Midnight Rider News Podcast. Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm Stephen Paddock, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, court historians, and textbook conglomerates that control information today. Tonight we have episode 024, What Happened in Vegas. Our featured guest is Midnight Rider News contributor BRIAN LLOYD. And believe me, folks, tonight, what happened in Vegas will not stay in Vegas. Okay, so let's clean the castle first, if we may. Please allow us to say that we're on Facebook at Midnight Rider News Show. That's Midnight Rider News Show. We're on Twitter at MWN_ST Patrick. LinkedIn at ST Patrick. And of course, the humble abode at MidnightRiderNews.com. That's writer, WRITER, MidnightRiderNews.com. A special hello goes out to all those who found us on Twitter and everyone who found us at the American Free Press. So we want to say hi to all of you. The archives are free and can also be found at MidnightRiderNews.com. So, without further ado, we'll be back with BRIAN LLOYD. He's the godfather of reality television, and now he has taken the reality of the JFK assassination straight to the establishment media in part 2 of the Jim Garrison tapes. John Barber is a pioneer, a conversationalist, a storyteller, and a friend of truth seekers worldwide.
Hi, this is John Barber, writer-director of the American media and the second assassination of President John F. Kennedy. If you want to know how I continue to challenge the media elites in the name of Jim Garrison's legacy, listen to episode 10 of the Midnight Rider News Show.
My friend and Midnight Rider News contributor BRIAN LLOYD has been a practicing trial lawyer in Washington, D.C. and Maryland for over 20 years. His undergraduate degrees were in political science and history, with a particular focus on the revolutions of 18th and 19th century Europe. It was then when he realized that he was only being taught part of the story, as many of the most important details were deliberately omitted. Now, he's a student of current affairs and alternative historical analysis, and while he is most well-versed in the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and Martin Luther King Jr., as well as Watergate, he spent recent years focusing on how the U.S. has transformed itself into a permanent war state. And within that framework, BRIAN has heavily researched the pertinent issues of 9/11, the War on Terror, and the organized and protected global drug trade with countries such as Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Colombia. Very recently, BRIAN worked with John Barber on the production of The American Media and the Second Assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Important for us tonight, Brian has been on top of these murders in Las Vegas from the moment the story broke. He was our first choice for a guest tonight, and I'm glad he agreed to come on to talk about this very politically and emotionally charged story. So, Brian, how are you this evening?
Basically, I feel fine. I'm a little under the weather due to a cold, so I hope you'll forgive me if I sound a little off.
Absolutely, and we thank you for coming on despite being under the weather. You know, you've had some pretty late nights doing the research on this, so again, thank you very much for that. Now, this story is a few weeks old, but it doesn't really seem like we know much more than we did the first week. Stories from the Strip seem to still be rife with confusion, and many of the witnesses are now expressing a serious frustration with police. Now, let me say up front that Las Vegas is absolutely my favorite city in America. I've been there many times, and I believe I understand its culture. For those who may not, it is a very unique place, as Brian will explain tonight. Now, Brian, you've poured through witness testimony as well as the stories that have sort of hovered on the outer perimeter of this whole thing, and there are still some pretty interesting questions that exist, are there not?
Yes, the story of what occurred in the mass shooting in Las Vegas on October 1st of this year, 2017, is an extremely confusing, strange, and anomalous story. Let me start with some background information and what the current, quote, official story is. And I say, quote, because the current story seems to be ever-changing. The current official story is that Stephen Paddock, an alleged multimillionaire who made his money in real estate, was an avid gambler and a frequent visitor to, and was apparently well known in Vegas. He lived in Mesquite, Nevada, some 80 miles from Vegas itself. He was unmarried with no children, but he had a Filipino girlfriend named Mary Lou Danley, who was 62 years old and with whom he lived in Mesquite. I believe he met her in Vegas, and she frequently visited Vegas and the casinos with him. He rented 2 suites. We're told he rented 2 suites on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay, which is an MGM property and a casino, again owned by MGM, is the owner of Mandalay Bay. And I'll discuss the ownership a little later in our discussion. He's alleged to have brought an almost ridiculous and cartoonish amount of military-style assault rifles like AR-15s, AK-47s, at least 1 bolt-action rifle, tripods, handguns, numerous high-capacity magazines, and other weapons to his room prior to his alleged mass shooting. The police claim he got all these weapons to these 2 suites he had rented adjoining one another in separate trips that were at least 8 hours apart. Now, for those who don't know, and the police maintain that he had 27 guns in these 2 hotel suites, not counting others found at his homes. And so if anyone knows anything about weapons and high-capacity magazines, there's a great deal of weight involved. So it's somewhat curious at the beginning that he was able to get all that stuff up there. Not impossible, but a little bit curious. At any rate, he was a man who had several brothers, Eric being the most noteworthy, as he gave several long and often disjointed interviews to the press from his Florida home. Eric described that they grew up in a dysfunctional home where his father was a wanted bank robber and had abandoned his family. Again, according to his younger brother Eric, Stephen Paddock had no specific affinity for guns and believed he perhaps had a few handguns in a safe, and perhaps 1 long gun. His brother described no history of gun loving or ownership, and he did not describe any history of mental aberrations. He did describe the alleged shooter as somewhat of a loner and aloof, but one that could take care of himself. He also described him as a decent guy who took care of the people in his life, who had contributed to making his family rich and never shot or hurt anybody. Eric described their childhood as tough, again, in that their mother had been deserted by the formerly wanted by the FBI bank robber father of theirs, who abandoned his family, and he and his brothers did what they could to get by, perhaps implying some illegal activity. The man gives very odd interviews, so it's difficult, but he sort of alleged that they did what they had to get by. According to his brother, Eric, younger brother Eric, and a woman named Lisa Crawford, who was a former property manager of one of Stephen Paddock's rental properties, he was a very generous landlord who actually cared about his tenants and would let people be late on their rent. She described him as the best landlord you could have. Indeed, she said in tears that he cared for people. Another brother, Bruce, living in an assisted living community in L.A., was recently arrested for child pornography charges. I believe this Bruce Paddock is asserting his innocence, but that's a pending matter. Perhaps unrelated, I don't know. There are those who think crazy runs in the family. There's certainly some crazies in his family. Prior to the events of October 1st of this year, he purchased a ticket for his girlfriend, Mary Lou Danley, to the Philippines, where she made a trip home to see her family, and he subsequently wired her $100,000. Later, the younger brother, Eric Paddock, stated that he really cared for Mary Lou, and he was certain that he was just trying to get her away from what he was seemingly planning. The brother Eric described the events attributed to his brother as mind-boggling, and he didn't know how to process it. He said it felt like an asteroid hit him. In other words, he had no inkling that any of this was brewing in this man's mind, if it ever was. According to a Sun article, a British newspaper, Danley described that he would scream in bed, this Stephen Paddock, that is, would scream in bed, and he feared that he might have mental problems. She apparently believed it was his way of breaking up by sending her to the Philippines. They lived in a 55-year-old plus affluent retirement community with a golf course and other amenities. So other than Danley's assertion to the Sun, the brother, the former employee I mentioned, and even the police admit they cannot conceive of a motive for his alleged act. Now, the Las Vegas Police Department, who has changed the timeline of events several times, according to them, Paddock rented the two adjoining suites where he slowly managed to get approximately 27 guns, as I mentioned, and many high-capacity magazines, which are very heavy, by the way. He allegedly broke holes in one window of each of the suites that he had adjoining each other with a hammer, and at one point began indiscriminately shooting at the crowd of people attending the Route 91 Music Festival, which was a country music western festival, or country western music festival, pardon me. This was the third day and final day of this Route 91 Music Festival. The rooms he rented, I think I mentioned, were on the 32nd floor. The police have stated that he began his shooting spree at approximately 10:05 p.m. From the vantage point of his two rooms, he could have easily fired down into the crowd of concert-goers across the street at this Route 91 open-air country music festival. The festival was approximately 1,100 feet from the so-called Sniper's Nest on the 32nd floor of Mandalay Bay, the casino he was residing in at that time. Most people have seen pictures of the two broken windows. Again, the police allege he broke them out with a hammer and then started firing. The police and the FBI stated at first that he was approached by a hotel security guard named Jesus Campos, who was checking on either a locked door or an open door for a different room, and that he interrupted Stephen Paddock during his mass shooting, thereby saving lives. He was quickly dubbed a hero. Later, they changed Campos's arrival on Paddock's floor to 9:59, 1 minute before 10, so that's 6 minutes before Paddock allegedly began shooting at the crowd. Paddock allegedly shot 200 rounds of fire through his hotel door, striking Jesus Campos in the leg. Campos stayed to help the police, however, despite his leg wound from the high-powered rifle. Campos radioed to his supervisor and used his cell phone as well. Again, I'll discuss the ownership of Mandalay Bay a little later. When the police finally arrived to Paddock, the shooting had stopped, which according to the police lasted 10 minutes. The police seemed to have taken great pride in getting to Paddock in only 17 minutes. The police and the FBI stated he had video equipment set up in his room and installed a camera in the food cart outside of his door. And anyone who stayed in a hotel knows the food cart is what you put outside your door after they brought you room service. So he allegedly had a camera rigged to that, with the implication being that that would alert him to when someone was coming, either security or the police. First the police said they shot him, and then now we're told that he shot himself in the head, and he was found dead in the room alone. His body was on top of a gun. Another gun on a tripod was over one of his legs, despite him not being near the windows. The police searched his car and his homes and determined he had even more weapons. A, quote, leaked photo or photos showing Paddock lying in a pool of blood, hands to his side, with a pistol he used 5 feet away and upwards from his head, which is curious, but we'll discuss the photographs again in a little bit. Approximately 58 people were killed and over 500 were wounded. I understand from a news report today that only a few of these 500 injured remain hospitalized, and so most people have been discharged, which is, of course, good news. That's pretty much the official story as it stands now, give or take a few details. But this seemingly solved crime of a lone gunman who took his own life after shooting as many people as he could has enormous amounts of anomalies and discrepancies that call the official version into question. I will try to outline them and try to address as many as we have time for. I think we can discuss them all. The first is a very curious 4chan post. 4chan is a website where you can chat politically, allegedly anonymously. But a 4chan post on 9/11 of 17 eerily predicted the event and named Las Vegas and the perpetrators. We're going to address this later, and this will also cover, again, the owners of the Mandalay Bay and the company executives. The second point is footage exists of an interview with a young 21-year-old lady who was in Vegas for her birthday, who was described that a short Hispanic woman and her short Hispanic boyfriend had obnoxiously pushed their way to the front of the concert and were harassing the woman so much that event security escorted them out of the venue. Now, this eyewitness claimed this short Hispanic woman was repeatedly shouting, "You're all going to die." Now, this was 45 minutes before the shooting, and as far as I know, the police have never mentioned this event at all. Next, there's a taxi driver who took a cell phone movie which shows lights and sounds of gunfire, both close and distant. She was in the cab line, and in Vegas, the lines for cabs can be quite long at the casinos. So she was in the cab line to go to the Mandalay Bay, and again, her footage is part of what we'll talk about. A major part of this is there are numerous very credible witnesses that describe that there were many shots in numerous other casinos at times long after Paddock allegedly stopped shooting, and many are completely convinced that there were additional gunmen on the ground. The police maintain that Paddock acted alone and there were no ground shooters. Another point is the curious and changing story of the Mandalay Bay security guard Jesus Campos, who we'll talk about. Another point, an uninjured witness made a long Facebook post on October 4th where she described with great particularity that she was 100% sure there were shooters on the ground and planned on starting a group of witnesses that would help lead to the truth. This was in a Facebook post, which anyone can look up, the screenshots, even Snopes copied those screenshots. On October 9th, we are told she died in her sleep of an epileptic seizure while she was home alone. Another point is the curious conclusion within 2 hours of the attack that Paddock was a lone gunman. So Paddock's dead, and the police are convinced he acted alone. Given some of the witness testimony I'm going to tell you about, it's very curious that they came up with that conclusion so quickly. There's also a Mandalay craps dealer that stated there was active live shooter drills in the preceding 2 days at the Mandalay Bay. We'll talk about issues of security at Mandalay Bay. As it's a casino, many of us believe every inch is photographed. Apparently that's open to question, and we'll discuss that. There are bizarre anomalies in the police radio dispatch, which don't seem to make any sense. Again, when the story of Campos, the Jesus Campos security guard, comes out, the anomalies in the radio dispatch of the police are even more striking. There's also the strange fact that at one of the houses Paddock owned, even after having been searched and cordoned off by the police, somebody managed to burglarize the home, entering through the front door. The police claim nothing was stolen. I find that a little curious that someone was able to break into a crime scene and the police know nothing about it. Another point is within days, ISIS claimed responsibility. And then there are anomalies in the so-called leaked photos. So of these 13 or so bullet points I just laid out, I'll try to address them all with a particular emphasis on the witnesses to the other shootings, the strange story of Jesus Campos, security issues at Mandalay Bay, and the police tape, and finally the eerie and prescient 4chan post. So let's start with the initial reports of the event. At 12:23 a.m., which is approximately 2 hours from the time the shots from Mandalay Bay had ceased, Vegas NBC affiliate KSNV was covering the story. It is time-stamped and shows the early lack of knowledge in that they were describing 2 dead, 24 injured, and 1 dead suspect. So obviously this is a very early report where they didn't know much yet. Now this station had a retired detective on as a consultant, Phil Ramos, who expressed the belief that there were likely multiple shooters. Again, the beginning of this broadcast is maybe 20 or 30 minutes long, is at 12:23 a.m., so really the evening of the night of the shooting. But by 12:34, the station was reporting that there was only 1 shooter. So again, someone's feeding them, likely the police or the FBI, that there's only 1 shooter, because they quickly switched to that, which sort of threw the retired detective expert Ramos off a little bit, because he had thought that there had to be more than 1 shooter. That same report also mentioned a suspicious device in a van outside of the Luxor, which was being examined, and it mentioned shots at the Tropicana, which is pretty much across the street or very close. Ramos, the expert, opined that these may have been diversionary activities. Well, this same news report included the important and officially ignored interview of Brianna Hendricks, a 21-year-old who, as I mentioned, had come to Vegas to celebrate her birthday. She was there with her mother, Sean, and she was the one who described the Hispanic couple exclaiming, "You're all going to die," 45 minutes before the shooting even began. She saw them get escorted out by the venue security. And in this report, the reporters were actually pretty diligent, and they asked some very specific questions when she gave her answers. And she gave very specific answers to the follow-up questions. She really described somebody who seemed to have foreknowledge, and it's extremely odd that she's never been tracked down. She doesn't appear to be part of the police investigation. She's never been mentioned by the police. Nobody seems to be looking for this Hispanic woman or couple. At first, citizen investigators couldn't find a trace of these 2 women, and meaning Brianna and her mother, Sean Hendricks. And then a Facebook link appeared, which seems to show Brianna and her mother, Sean, with other family members. It's an odd-looking Facebook link, and it doesn't really look like what one normally sees on Facebook. Some claim the photos contained in it were photoshopped. Others point out that for family group photo. For example, there was one photo with 7 or 8 people in it. There was only 2 likes. Of course, this may mean nothing, but people have had a hard time tracking these 2 individuals down, Brianna Hendricks and her mother, to find out more about this Hispanic woman who seemed to have foreknowledge that everyone was going to, quote, die. So I'm not sure what to make of the Facebook post, and I wouldn't put tons of stock in that other than to say that the police certainly aren't mentioning her. So forgetting the Facebook Photoshop idea, the important thing to remember is the police never mentioned these witnesses. They never mentioned the Hispanic couple, and they appear not to be seeking them. One former Navy man, who gave his name as Longo, seemed perturbed in an interview that night as he was explained that there was, when he heard the news that this Hispanic woman had gave such a dire warning, he thought, if venue security had done its job, a lot of people could have saved their lives. So he was just one witness speaking at the scene. Next, we have the female taxi driver who was waiting in a line of cabs, who videoed the shooting with her cell phone. This contains the flashing lights on the 4th floor, which many believe are simply strobe lights. That's likely accurate, as the strobe was on before, during, and after the shooting. But at first it had many people believing there's video evidence of shots from the 4th floor. It does appear that that was a strobe light. More important is it records the sound of the gunfire, some very close and some a good distance away. Now, many have argued that the farther away sounding shots were simply echoes. But there are excellent videos that exist by ballistic experts who claim to be able to prove different guns and therefore multiple shooters through waveform analysis and just simple listening. When you hear 8 shots and then you hear the echo is supposedly 13, well, then you know it's not really an echo. But again, excellent videos exist by ballistic experts who have used this waveform analysis to break down, and even they've determined that there's different types of weapons being used as well. Now, in fairness, the shooting area is in a cavernous area with tall buildings everywhere, and shots may have ricocheted. This could account for what some might possibly have thought were additional shots. Again, I think personally that some of these ballistics guys have done a very good job of debunking that, but nonetheless, there is that possibility. There certainly were some echoes. There's no doubt about that. Some have called this the Zapruder film of the Vegas incident. She can be heard to explain, the cab driver that is, where the hell are the cops? I'm right in front of Mandalay Bay. Finally, she says, I'm getting out of here. And again, I believe these good analysis have shown that there were different weapons used at different locations. It should also be noted that Maverick Helicopters is 4.5 blocks away, and helicopters were seen and heard by witnesses. So again, the experts claim to be able to distinguish the helicopter or helicopters from the gunfire. Some have argued that the helicopters were shooting at the crowd, and they use the argument of seeing flashing lights. The videos allegedly showing this didn't entirely convince me, although I do remain open to the idea. It does remain unclear why the helicopters were just kind of hovering around. But it was close to a Maverick helicopters 4.5 blocks away. As to the shots in other casinos and people who reported seeing gunmen on the ground are very numerous. Most famous is probably Renee Downs. She was at the piano bar of the Bellagio, which is 1.4 miles from Mandalay Bay, with many large buildings in between. She and her husband Daniel, a former Marine, heard shots come through the Bellagio front lobby glass and a stampede of people. So her husband threw her to the ground, covering his wife and another woman. Now, she posted a live Facebook feed that night showing the confusion in the Bellagio and noted that they were in lockdown and not allowed to leave. Mrs. Downs posted a second live Facebook feed the next night, retracing all their movements. She was also interviewed via Skype or some other platform by a blogger. It's about 40 or 50 minutes, and she completely reiterates her story, adding that friends of theirs were at the concert and were strangely not responding to her texts. Bellagio Security, after the shots at the Bellagio, ordered everyone to the back of the hotel. In her Facebook post, an employee can be seen confirming this event. When they checked out days later, their room was comped, and the woman behind the counter leaned forward and cryptically said, "There were no shots at the Bellagio," almost implying, "You've got a free room. There were no shots here. What happened here didn't happen." She stated that the shots were at approximately 11 o'clock, so it could not have been Paddock, who was dead by then. She also contacted a friend, Nadia Gist, or Gist, I don't know how she pronounces it, probably Gist, an employee of the Paris casino, who was complaining that there were shots in the Paris as well, but nobody was acknowledging it. She was pointing out, "Look, I work here. Why can't we, I don't understand why we're not admitting that there were shots here." Next, we have Corrine Lomas and her boyfriend, Taylor Benji. They were interviewed outside on the night of the shootings and were adamant that, as Corrine, the female, said, there's no physically human possible way that the Mandalay shooter was the only one. Her boyfriend agreed. When the reporter told her that the police said it was only one guy on the 32nd floor, she said, "No way." Shots continued by ground shooters in the parking lot, and again was extremely emphatic, saying there's no possible way that there was only one shooter. Then you have Aurora Monroe, an African-American woman who was in Planet Hollywood. In her YouTube post, she describes hearing gunshots there at Planet Hollywood from approximately 11:15 to 11:22. She called her brother at 11:22 and texted him at 2:58 in a.m. when she was allowed to leave. In her YouTube post, she was ready to show the camera screenshots of these things, and then she said, "The hell with it." She said she did not see the shooter, but she certainly heard the shots, and is utterly convinced that shots were fired from in there. Then there's the tragic tale of Kimberly Sushamel. She was traumatized, but escaped unhurt. So she was at the concert and did not get shot. On October 4th, so it's 3 days after, she posted a long Facebook explanation of her experience and declared she was going to start a victims group to get to the truth. She explained that she was near the front and heard firecrackers, as many did, that even Jason Aldean, the performer who was performing at that time, noticed and looked somewhat perturbed about. As a side note, many of the witnesses closest to the stage also heard or saw fireworks and stated similarly that they noticed Jason Aldean looked over, and didn't seem very happy about the fireworks. So, again, the theme of fireworks comes up again and again, to the point where I think it's likely that fireworks were detonated, small ones probably, but nonetheless it was annoying at first. Little did people know it was a precursor to shots that were about to ring out. So according to Miss Sushamel, about 15 seconds later, the first volley of shots rang out. Someone said to her, "It's just fireworks, calm down, geez." And then the second volley of shots occurred. And she said people were still not reacting just yet, but then after the third volley, everyone began running, and she claimed the shots were so close that she believed she was being followed by shooters. She said every direction she went, the shooting seemed like it got closer. She really started to panic, and at the presence of shooters on the ground, she called her husband, thinking she was going to die. She called her husband at 10:07 p.m. and then called her grandmother, who was watching her kids. She claims the bullets were coming from all directions, and again, the further away she got from the venue, the closer the shots seemed. She was 100% sure that there were shooters on the ground. As she ran to Hooters to meet up with some of her, there were 4 other people with her, to try to meet up with others that she had been separated from, a stampede of people poured out, with her believing shots were fired there too. Many, including herself, ran to nearby McCarran Airport, which is really it's very close also to the Mandalay Bay. It's the Vegas airport. So many of them ran to the McCarran Airport, and people were angrily demanding, are we safe here? Now, when no answer was really forthcoming, they all left the building as well. She describes running past a liquor store, which gave her some bottled water, and then she kind of stopped to cough and vomit, and she admitted she was out of shape and doesn't run, never did run, and she was not used to this. Again, there's a lot of people who describe people vomiting as well, and I can imagine with the blood and the gore, that wouldn't have been unusual. So now she's reunited with her friends, but they're unable to get a taxi or a limo because they had 5 people, and that was apparently one too many. So they kept running. She said she ran past the University of Las Vegas, and then while running on Tropicana Avenue, a dark sedan with a small Hispanic woman yelled at her tauntingly from the vehicle. Well, she admittedly doesn't understand what had been said, and according to her October 4th Facebook post, she stated, quote, "The media can suck it. They have no idea what went down," end quote. And as I said, Snopes even has screenshots of her Facebook posts. Well, knowing that the event occurred on October 1st and her Facebook post was October 4th, sadly 5 days later, this 28-year-old young lady was found dead in her home alone, allegedly having an epileptic seizure in her sleep. Next, we've got a man in a store called the Miracle Mile Shop. I don't have his name, but he told police that he had personally seen 2 gunmen. So again, if it's Paddock or is there gunmen on the streets, you'll see, as I believe, that there's compelling evidence that there was more than one shooter. We've got the incredible story of Gio Rios. He posted on YouTube with his girlfriend what they had gone through 1 week after the shootings. They were in the front row of the concert. He too heard the fireworks and noticed Jason Aldean not liking it either. And once the shots rang out, he explained how long it took for them to get out of the venue, as there were many exits. He described a long time of running, dropping to rest, vomiting, and pushing on. It was very stressful and emotional and physically taxing. They went into the Tropicana as directed by a police officer. Once inside, he described that he encountered a man, heavily built with bushy eyebrows, but very muscular, like a military-type individual, who was very fit and large. This man, he describes that he encountered, the heavily built, muscular man, had some kind of uniform on and was carrying a briefcase, who had come from the pool area of the Tropicana. Mr. Rios had spent the night basically protecting himself and his girlfriend, and he wanted to avoid crowds, and he resisted going to where security was directing people, which in this case in Tropicana was the casino itself. He states the man was extremely calm while everyone else was freaking out. So Rios just asked him, "Do you work here?" And the man said, "Go with the other people. Go into the casino." And Rios again said, "Do you work here? And what's in your briefcase?" He then states that the man calmly smiled and looked him directly in the eyes and kind of stared and said, "Oh, nothing." And then 3 bursts of gunfire inside the Tropicana started a stampede of people out of the casino. However, this man calmly walked into the casino. Rios is under the belief, as is his girlfriend, that he may have held up this man's nefarious plan. Perhaps he was another shooter. That's what Rios has in his mind. Now, we don't know if that's true, but that's what he thought. Outside of the hotel, he had seen and heard shots from the New York, and Excalibur casinos area. And there he states he saw the muzzle flashes, and he's familiar with weapons. So, again, here's direct eyewitness testimony to shooters on the ground. And anyone can watch this video, like any of these things I'm talking about. It's easily accessible, and you can judge the credibility of these witnesses for yourself. I find him to be very credible. When he made it back to his hotel room, he heeded the admonition of the FBI to contact them and not the media if you know something. So he did that, and they called the FBI, and they transcribed his call. And he's of the opinion, very convinced, that this was a coordinated terror attack, well planned, choreographed, and orchestrated quite well. He and his girlfriend are sure of ground shots, and that many bullets were flying around vertically. One witness on one side of Paddock's room initially stated in Australia that there were multiple shooters and that a security guard was killed. He later recanted. I don't know why, but he did. There's another anonymous witness on the other side of the rooms Paddock had said had rented the suites. They said they slept through the whole thing. They knew nothing until the SWAT team woke them up. Again, that seems kind of odd if you're unloading hundreds of rounds of military adjusted weapons, meaning they were transformed into automatic weapons, and what we're told is, hundreds of shots went out. But the people next door slept right through that, apparently. They didn't know anything until the SWAT team woke them up. There are other witnesses that have come forward, but the time limits us here. So I'll move on to the story of Mandalay Bay security guard Jesus Campos, which is truly a bizarre tale. He claims he was trying to get either a jammed door or a door that was ajar, something, one of the two, and that he thought he heard drilling on the 32nd floor. Since the door was blocked, he ascended one flight and came down another stairwell to the 32nd floor. And as noted, it was first reported that he interrupted the shootings. That story changed to him being shot in the hallway of the 32nd floor as Stephen Paddock allegedly shot 200 rounds of high-powered rifles through the hotel door, hitting Campos in the leg. Unfazed, he radioed his boss and used his cell phone as well. Strangely, the police never knew, or it took a long time for them to figure out where the shooter was, despite Campos's report and the fact that 200 rounds of rifle fire had come out of Paddock's room down the hallway. I would have guessed, and I think most people would agree, that if you fire a weapon in any hotel, much less 200 rounds of an assault rifle through the door, and you strike a security guard, and he reports it 6 minutes before this man allegedly starts his assault on the crowd, something should have been done immediately, and the identification or the location rather, of the shots should have been known immediately. And later we'll talk about the police tapes, and you'll hear that the police, they didn't know where the shots came from. So there's real questions about this guy, what he did, and again, the story changed. As the most key eyewitness, perhaps the only eyewitness, the closest person, he suddenly left town for Mexico while the investigation was pending. He returned a few days later, and border documents show him driving back with Vegas tags. This was revealed on the Tucker Carlson show. The only journalist who seems to be asking any hard questions about this event. Campos was scheduled, Jesus Campos, the security guard, was scheduled to give an interview with Sean Hannity and others, and he just disappeared. Later, as if MGM, the owner of Mandalay Bay, seemed to be directing him, as he did a brief appearance on the Ellen DeGeneres show, where she only asked some softball questions, called him a hero, and he was accompanied by his immediate supervisor. He seemed very uncomfortable, and Ellen DeGeneres, it should be known, has a relationship with MGM Vegas properties, including her own slot machines there. So the interview was short, and she made it clear that since he didn't want to talk about it, he shouldn't. He's done enough. So, that kind of puts the end to any questioning of Jesus Campos, because allegedly it was all figured out on the Ellen DeGeneres show, which, again, anyone can YouTube that, and I don't think you'll find that that's very definitive at all. Now we have the leaked photos. Many people believe that the photos of Paddock's room in a dead paddock were leaked by the police as a way of signaling that they're being pressured from higher-ups. Others believe they were intentionally leaked to solidify the narrative. But the photos raise serious questions, however. In them, they depict a dead Paddock with bright red blood around his head, with a few shell casings seemingly dropped into the blood. It's almost like blood pudding, it's so thick. And these casings are dropped in with no blood on the top of them. So it almost gives the appearance that somebody just sprinkled a few shells around this dead man's head who was bleeding. In addition to him laying in his own pool of blood from his head, he appears to be laying on top of another blood stain, which had already seeped into the carpet, so it wasn't as distinguishable, but it's clearly a stain. So it's very odd that he's laying in a blood stain that had already seeped into the carpet, and then his head's there with, again, massive amount of blood coming out of it with some shells around him. There's, again, no blood on the exposed tops of the casings, and he was laying with his arm straight down by his side, with the pistol he allegedly used to kill himself was 5 feet from the top of his head. The fresh blood appears around his head, and again, as I said, he appears to have been in an older blood spot. There also aren't large numbers of casings from all his mass shootings, we're told he unleashed on the crowd. The guns are guns haphazardly around and not by the windows. A suitcase can be seen, which some think money can be seen in. You can also see a pile of magazines, high-capacity magazines, stacked neatly nearby. Remember, the police first said they killed him, and now he killed himself. The picture also shows a glimpse of a man's shoe wearing jeans. So that means at least 2 people were in that room when the pictures were taken, the unknown man and the photographer. Now, with regard to money in the briefcase, there are some that posit, and again, it's just a theory, so I'm not here to endorse it, I'm just reporting it. But there are some that feel this is something like a Fast and Furious type of event where a gun transaction went bad, and that's why he had cameras, and that's why there were all that weaponry and maybe a suitcase of cash, and something either went wrong deliberately or perhaps inadvertently, and then he was shot, and then these others went on a killing spree. That's a theory. I don't know that to be true, and it's not something I endorse. But it could explain the presence of all these guns, because it was, again, a ridiculous amount of guns he had up there to kill people, if that's what his goal was. So I've talked with several veterans and Marines and sharpshooters, and in fairness, they've said that if he had all the magazines near his weapons by the 2 windows, he actually could have pulled this off, despite his age and being out of shape. Often you hear people say there's no way this 64-year-old man could have done this. But again, if everything had been prepared properly, it does appear that he could have gone to each window and let out rounds of fire and on the crowd indiscriminately. So I don't think it's true that he couldn't physically do it. I think it's unlikely, but it does appear that he could have done it. And I just say that of all fairness. And then finally, we've got the 4chan posting. 4chan is a website where people can anonymously discuss politics and other issues. And extremely curiously, as I mentioned, on 9/11 of that year, 2017, this year, a thread was entitled, quote, "If anything happens tomorrow, it's Mossad, a false flag level alpha," end quote. In the ensuing conversation on that thread, a man calling himself John stated, quote, "Look, I feel bad for some of you on this website, so I'll let you in on a little secret. If you live in Las Vegas or Henderson, stay inside tomorrow. Don't go anywhere where there are large groups of people. Also, if you see 3 black vans parked next to each other, immediately leave the area. You're welcome, John." As the thread continued, people discussing and so forth, John chimed in again, and he said, quote, "Look, it's called a high incident project. They want to make the American public think that places with extremely high security aren't safe. You will see laws and regulations proposed within the next few years to put more metal detectors and other security devices. Media and politicians will be saying places with lots of police need even more police. I can't guarantee that anything will happen tomorrow, but Las Vegas is on their minds." End quote. Now, that was on 9/11, a few weeks before the incident on October 1st. So that's a pretty stark prediction, if that's what it was. He later added, too, quote, "If their plan is successful, the state of Nevada will pass a law making all casinos have mandatory metal detectors and backscatter machines. Soon after, a federal law will be passed to put these machines in universities, high schools, federal buildings, you name it. OSI Systems and Chertoff, meaning Michael Chertoff, are the main producers of these machines. Sometime around 2020, Chertoff and OSI will merge into a single company. After they merge, the owners will sell off their stock and make billions in profit. Mr. Chertoff has been in touch with Sheldon Adelson. Mr. Adelson will become a huge sponsor of these machines, and he will be the first to put them in his casinos when the law passes. This is my last message, and don't expect me to return anytime soon." End quote. As a side note, the Wynn Casino has already installed those devices. So it's cryptic indeed. Michael Chertoff was, of course, a key player in the 9/11 saga. He was the second director of Homeland Security under Bush from 2005 to 2009. Thereafter, he co-founded the Chertoff Group, a private security consulting agency. After the underwear bomber, which is another preposterous story for another day, the Chertoff Group began promoting the backscatter machines in all airports. It was then revealed that one of his clients was OSI, which owns Rapiscan, the makers of these machines. And a man named Deepak Chopra, not the author celebrated by Oprah, but a different Deepak Chopra, was a significant donor to the Democratic Party and founder of OSI, and was so close to Obama that he accompanied him to India on a trade mission. As I mentioned, getting into the ownership, MGM Properties owns the Mandalay Bay Casino. MGM is a Vegas-based casino conglomerate with almost 70,000 employees and is a publicly traded company. The CEO is a man named James Murren, M-U-R-R-E-N, who happens to be a sitting member of the Department of Homeland Security's National Infrastructure Advisory Council, and he sits on a group called the Critical Infrastructure Security and Resilience Research and Development Working Group, where they write reports and promote security devices. His wife, Heather Murren, worked for the Obama administration. Laura Loomer, an independent journalist, best known for badgering the police in press conferences with hard questions, uncovered, in addition to the food receipts of Paddock's room and valet receipts showing that Paddock was in the hotel longer than the police first admitting, forcing them to change their story. But she also uncovered an internal memo from Jim Moran, the CEO of MGM Properties, which owns Mandalay Bay. In the memo, which again anyone can look for and find on the internet, apparently Jim Moran stated that he announced that the racism and bigotry in Charlottesville, that he would donate company money to numerous left-wing groups, and the memo stated that he would match any employee that did the same. These included the ADL, the SLPC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, SPLC, and CAIR, C-A-I-R, and civil rights groups and Muslim advocacy groups, many of which George Soros contributes to. As another commentator noted, Within days of Charlottesville, which enraged or distressed Mr. Murren so much, there was a radical Islam attack in Barcelona. A Missouri Democrat had publicly wished that Trump would be assassinated. There were mass attacks against police with 8 shot and 2 killed. And in Chicago, in the 2 weeks after Charlottesville, there was 96 citizens shot and 17 killed. None of these seemed to bother Jim Murren, though. Jim Murren donated to CARE, named by Justice Department as unindicted co-conspirators to Muslim terrorists. The FBI produced charts showing CARE was created to support Hamas. CARE advises Muslims not to cooperate with the FBI. And even Chucky Schumer said CARE has links to terrorism and intimate links to Hamas. So it's very curious that he had all these, so many issues that surround us. His big concern was the Charlottesville thing, the event. Sheldon Adelson is a Vegas-based casino mogul that basically every presidential candidate grovels before for campaign money. Trump met with him before a debate at one of his properties, and Trump focused on security in that debate. Trump also met in Vegas with Sheldon Adelson after the attack. Again, the CEO of MGM, James Murren, sold 80% of his own company's stock, which is an unusual practice for a CEO, with the idea that if once the stock goes down, you can buy it back at a cheaper price and make some money. SEC filings also show that Adelson put options on MGM stock, meaning he was banking on the value going down. So again, there's a whole lot of hints at foreknowledge from various parties here. Finally, a few loose ends. Aaron Rouse is the Vegas FBI man in charge, and he rarely speaks, but he seems to loom over the sheriff to make sure he sticks to the approved narrative. Rouse famously said, "Trust the FBI. We can't give in to conjecture." Another news report claimed that FBI headquarters in D.C. told Rouse to keep it simple and wrap it up. On to the oddities in the police tapes, which the tapes itself go for about an hour and 23 minutes. There's a condensed version of 26 minutes, and even that leaves one utterly scratching their head and wondering, well, what's going on here? So some of the oddities that, of course, by police tapes, we're talking about police communicating with one another over their police radios. These are recorded and can be listened to later. Even back in the Kennedy assassination, we had that. So some of the oddities in the police audio tapes are shots are coming from Gate 7, which was repeated. And then another one is a white car is going down the wrong way on the boulevard heading to Mandalay Bay, which that boulevard had been closed off. Civilians are saying that there are 3 shooters. Then you've got, as these police officers get closer to the alleged shooter on the 32nd floor of the Mandalay Bay, you have someone saying, "I'm on the 31st floor, and I can hear shots on the floor above me." And then also stated, shots fired on the 29th and 32nd floors. Again, Paddock was on the 32nd floor. But initially, and again, they repeated it by saying later, it seems confirmed that there are shooters on the 29th and 32nd floors. So immediately one should ask themselves, if Jesus Campos, had been shot 6 minutes before this man unleashed his 10-minute reign of terror on the crowd, and Jesus Campos says he reported it dutifully to his superior, why weren't the police notified, and why were the police going floor to floor unsure of where the shooter was? Also recall that this same man, Steve Paddock, allegedly had shot 200 rounds of assault weapons through a hotel door in a hallway, hitting a security guard, who then again relayed it to his superiors, and one would have thought the police. But when you hear the police tapes, all you hear is utter confusion and they're trying to zero in on where the shooter was. Now, if, in my own mind, I would think, let's say they dispatched 50 police officers to the scene, they'd have some, going up the stairs or securing the elevators or whatever, but certainly some of them would go talk to hotel security. It should not have been a mystery that where those shots came from, if they came from the 32nd floor, and these two rooms occupied by Stephen Paddock. And recall that one of his adjacent neighbors didn't hear any shooting, or perhaps they had the air conditioning on loud, who knows. But all this assault weapons going off in the room next door, they never heard about it. They only found out when the SWAT team woke them up. So that's somewhat curious. But those types of oddities in the police tapes just, again, really make you scratch your heads and wonder what would it take to get these police to know precisely. I mean, the windows were shot out. Anyone can see the pictures of the two windows that were shot out. Again, the hotel security guard had received a bullet and 200 rounds were fired down the hall. One would have thought that security would have been all over that in an instant. I've also been told by friends who stayed at the Mandalay Bay many times, they said, I got news for you. The first minute you took out a hammer and broke one of those windows, security would be in your face anyhow. So there's a lot of curious anomalies that really don't add up. I don't suggest any of them proves any one theory or other, but at the end of the day, I would really rely mostly on these witnesses who state that there were other shooters, and they saw them. They saw the muzzle flashes. They felt they were being chased. They saw vertical bullets. And then there's also an airport right by. The McCarran Airport is pretty close to Mandalay Bay. And the air traffic tapes, it's only a couple minutes of what I've heard, basically tell a pilot not to land as there are active shooters at the airport. Again, that would buttress some of the witness testimony that there were shooters on the ground. So it was certainly odd that the exits were blocked and the lights were put on the crowd during the shooting. Tucker Carlson, who broke the story of Campos returning to Mexico, in coming back to Vegas during the investigation, interviewed an attorney who was in the front row of the concert. This man has clients that he will be representing, and he asked the same questions that most of us have asked, or at least I have, which is, are you telling me that Mandalay Bay has no security cameras in the hall? And how did it take the police and the security so long to hone in on his room, where Campos had already reported what he'd reported a full 6 minutes before the mass shooting began? So those are just a partial list of some of the anomalies. I've omitted several of the witnesses that also gave accounts in the interest of time, but I want to be clear that anyone can view the YouTube clips of these witnesses being interviewed on the night or immediately thereafter of the shooting, and they are not just a little bit convinced, they are 100% convinced that there were other shooters. So we have reports of shots in Planet Hollywood. We know from Mandalay Bay, we're told there were shots, and probably were. Mandalay Bay, we've heard there's shots in Tropicana. We've heard there were shots in the Bellagio. We've heard there were shots in Paris. The Rios character relates that there were shots from the New York Excalibur casino area. There were reports of shots from the helicopter. Now, I've had 2 helicopters were flying around. Again, I'm not terribly convinced from what I saw that that's the case, but I wouldn't rule it out. So, interestingly, today Robert Downey Jr. called it a blood sacrifice. What does he know? I don't know. So really, the main theories seem to be that, a lone gunman, just multimillionaire, couple houses, couple planes. He's a former employee of Lockheed Martin, I should have mentioned as well. Avid gambler, seemed to enjoy it. According to everyone around him, he took care of the people around him. His brother described how he would order thousands of dollars of food, that the only thing Paddock would pay would be the tip because everything was comped. So again, his brother Eric describes, he was a fun guy to be with because he had a lot of money and he spent it on people who he liked. So for some reason, this 64-year-old multimillionaire who lived in a nice retirement community with a golf course and very nice amenities around him, for some reason snapped and went on a killing spree. That's one theory. As I've stated to others, you know, in the case of Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, people have spent years analyzing Lee Harvey Oswald's background and his elementary school grades and the fact that he got a tooth knocked out in a fist fight in elementary school, which I point out, all of that doesn't matter if he didn't do it. So here we are now left with a situation where we may spend the next 50 years speculating needlessly what made this man snap, when maybe he didn't snap at all. Maybe some kind of Fast and Furious situation, which we know was done under Eric Holder and the Obama administration. How Eric Holder isn't in prison for that, I don't know. For people who don't know what Fast and Furious was, it was the U.S. allowing guns to go to these Mexican cartels, and one of those same guns wound up killing an American security or border guard. So again, it's some cockamamie scheme to provide guns, and I'm not sure what the end goal to accomplish was, but it wound up killing a U.S. citizen. So this could have been something like a Fast and Furious thing. Perhaps he was selling weapons to ISIS, and everything was rigged, and that's why it was filmed, and that's why the camera, and that's how he got stuff up there, because he clearly seems to have had some help, which is what the sheriff initially said. When the sheriff said that, immediately Wolf Blitzer interviewed the mayor of Vegas. Her name is Carolyn Goodman. She's the wife of the former mayor, Oscar Goodman, who kind of brags about his gangster connections, quite frankly. But she sort of backtracked and said, well, the police said maybe, so, you know, she's leaving in and out so that we can just keep this as a lone gunman. So again, one theory is a lone gunman just lost it and shot up everybody. I don't know how you would explain the Bellagio and the other hotel shootings and the man who witnessed two gunmen and Mr. Rios who saw muzzle flashes outside of hotels. They don't seem to comport. So one theory is that. The other theory is some kind of Fast and Furious gone wrong. Another theory is, of course, this whole Michael Chertoff selling the metal detectors and backscatters and, helping push the agenda for more of a police state, essentially, which he will profit handsomely from. And then there's, extremists. I won't name them, but there are some who allege that they were all crisis actors and nobody died. I don't believe that, because I've seen enough of the witness testimony to know that people did die and people were shot. And so those that say it's a complete false flag, and there's those that argue that there weren't even shots. They were pumped in. The music, the sound of shots was pumped in over the music system. It was an incredibly elaborate hoax. So there's that theory. I think the Chertoff Adelson one is a little more likely than that. Those are really the competing theories. And again, I want to be clear, I've left out a lot of other witnesses just so that we could speak, in a reasonable amount of time. I think we covered a fair bit, and if you had any questions for me, go ahead and fire away.
Well, Brian, I think an obvious question to ask, and I think it's a question that many will be asking, is if it's true that there were all these shots or reports of shots at these other casinos, why were there no injuries at these other casinos?
Well, that's a excellent question. I can answer it in one measure by saying that Renee Downs at the Bellagio, who said shots just shattered through the glass. So she didn't see anyone hurt, and she's walking around with camera footage showing the mayhem, but, there's no one lying down bleeding and so forth. But she said she called not only the police, but that she called the news I don't know what channel, but one of the news outlets. And she was told that, or a sheriff at some point had said, listen, if we hear of shots at the Bellagio and we hear that no one's hurt, we're going to devote all our resources over to Mandalay Bay where we know there are people hurt. So you've asked an excellent question. I don't believe anyone is claiming to have been shot in any of these other hotels. but there is a great deal of witness testimony that there were shots in lots of hotels. And what it appears to me, if you know, again, I'm speculating, but it appears that they were stampeding people around in an effort to terrorize and threaten them. And so, you know, again, even from the hundreds of rounds we're told that Stephen Paddock shot from Mandalay Bay, 58 were killed, which is a terrible tragedy, and 500 were injured, but only out of that 500, only a few are even in the hospital anymore. So even from the mass shooting that was alleged to have come from Mandalay Bay in the 32nd floor, if you're just firing indiscriminately into a crowded concert, you might, especially with the type of weaponry he had, I would have thought there would have been a higher death count. So it's a good question. I can't answer it. I can say that I've seen no reports of someone else being shot in any of these hotels, but people claim that there were shooters on the ground. Some say they were being followed. Again, others say they saw two gunmen. So maybe the idea of the gunman wasn't to kill anyone. It was just to stampede them around and terrorize them. I don't know that answer, but it's an excellent question.
Now, you mentioned earlier that there are some similarities to Oswald and some similarities to the Kennedy assassination, so let's stick with that parallel. Now, the talk when we first started to question the Warren Commission was that Oswald was part of a conspiracy, but as the years went by, more and more researchers began to doubt Oswald's involvement altogether. So what I want to ask you is, do you think that as the years go by, as time passes, and that history starts to correct the mainstream story, do you think that Paddock will eventually be someone like Oswald who was found not to be involved at all?
Well, this is just my speculation now, and I will use your parallel to the Kennedy assassination because there are some striking parallels. Within hours, somehow the authorities concluded Lee Harvey Oswald was a lone gunman, despite reports to the contrary. There was Carolyn Walters, who saw people in numerous windows of the book depository. There was Arnold Rowland. There was Richard Randolph Carr. There were many people who claimed to have seen shooters in other places. And in the case in the 60s of the Kennedy assassination, they were simply ignored. And perhaps that's what's going on here. So immediately when Lee Harvey Oswald was killed 2 days later by Jack Ruby, the police position was, okay, well, case is closed. There's nothing else to see here, folks. When many of us might have thought, well, okay, maybe even if Oswald did it, wouldn't you still want to see if there's any Confederates at large? But apparently, again, in this case, and I told you, within the time frame of the evening broadcast from NBC news affiliate station in Las Vegas, by the end of their little transmission, they had already been told by the police that there was only one gunman, and that was it. So I don't know how one comes to these conclusions so quickly, but again, I do see parallels to the Kennedy assassination in that there is just a convenient, like the woman who claims that she saw the Hispanic woman saying, "You're all going to die." Why wouldn't the police investigate that? Now, if they are investigating it, we don't know because they haven't made it public. But they certainly are sticking to the story that Paddock did it alone. Yet you'd have to really get this young lady and her mother and impeach her as a witness. You'd have to show that you're lying, or you're trying to gain credit, or you're trying to inject yourself into the story, or maybe you misheard something. But when you see her interviewed extensively, one doesn't get that feeling. One gets the feeling that she's credible. So how can you square this foreknowledge by the Hispanic woman? How can you square what some of the financial transactions were done in advance? How can you square this very cryptic 4chan post, which names names and companies? Again, a lot of this stuff really does kind of match up with the Kennedy assassination. So it may be that when the case is closed, maybe they're considering it closed now. But when the case is ultimately closed, you may be just told that Stephen Paddock, multimillionaire, dual plane owner, multi-home owner, just for some reason snapped. And then you can speculate. Maybe we can find out he got beat up in 5th grade too. But if he didn't do it, and let's say a Fast and Furious type event occurred and something went wrong or was planned to go wrong and he was just executed, and then they went off on a killing spree, then again, he didn't do it. So it doesn't matter what his motivations were because he didn't do it. And many believe that he was probably thinking, or maybe knowing or thinking, that he was working for the FBI or helping the FBI, which would give the FBI a reason to cover it up. And as we know, Lee Harvey Oswald was a paid informant of the FBI, and that was kept under wraps. So, these are very good questions, but we don't know. And when I look at the pictures of Stephen Paddock laying in that hotel room in his blood, it looks, it just looks more like an execution, really, to me. But again, that's speculation. Really everything that I've stated can be explained away. But like the Kennedy assassination, one or two discrepancies or anomalies, okay, I get that. In the so-called fog of war, maybe you get something wrong. But when you start to see them just pile up, multiple, witnesses and it becomes cumulative where it's like, well, we're not being told the truth. And again, Tucker Carlson, to my knowledge, and I don't watch much TV, really hardly any, but I've seen him, dig in hard. Like, for example, he asked, with all due respect, why is Jesus Campos a hero? Now, he wasn't being mean-spirited. He's asking a real question, like, wait a minute. Okay, if he didn't stop the shooter, like you originally claimed, well, how is he a hero? What did he do to make him heroic? Again, I'm not belittling the man. I'm just suggesting that, for Ellen DeGeneres to give him I think they got him pro football, tickets because they didn't want to give him money. But, I can't explain that. But the parallels to Kennedy are very, very close to me because you've got a very strange event which looks highly orchestrated and organized. It's pinned on a guy who winds up dead, so there's no trial. And the police at that point say, well, since it's a lone gunman, there's nothing else to do. It's done. The killer's dead, and he shot himself, and there's no one to look for because he acted alone. So I do see parallels to the Kennedy assassination.
And again, I want to thank BRIAN LLOYD of Midnight Rider News for being on the show. Thank you, Brian. And if any information breaks, and I'm sure it will, I hope you'll be back on to tell everyone about it. So I want to thank you very much.
Well, I appreciate it, and if I can get some more information, I'll be sure to contact you. And again, most of what I've told you tonight has been open source stuff, so it didn't take me digging through archives to find this stuff. So I'm going really on what's currently is out there now. Things can change, and they have changed. More witnesses are speaking out, and again, a lot of them weren't hurt, but they're mentally scarred due to the trauma they endured. But I most certainly will report back to you if I learn more, and I will try to stay current with the topic, and I hope it helped. We only covered a few of the witnesses and a handful of the discrepancies, but I think there's enough there to suggest that perhaps we're not being told the truth by the mainstream media.
Fantastic job tonight, Brian. Thank you very much again.
Very good. Thanks, ST. See you now.
I'm ST Patrick. This is the Midnight Rider News Show, and we'll be right back. Listen to episode 008 of the Midnight Rider News Show to discover what responsibility the Secret Service holds for the JFK assassination, which agent mysteriously died before that fateful trip to Dallas, what Vince Palomera thinks of the theory that William Greer shot JFK, and how the agency handled both Squeaky Fromm and John Hinckley Jr.
Hi, this is Vince Palomera, author of The Not-So-Secret Service, Agency Tales from FDR to the Kennedy assassination to the Reagan era. If you want to hear more about what really happened behind closed doors at the White House, listen to episode 8 of the Midnight Rider News Show with ST Patrick.
When a major story breaks, you have two chances to get the truth. The first opportunity is within the immediate aftermath. When the news media interviews anyone they can find simply to have something new, witnesses are able to say what they know to be true in an unfiltered way. When that short time period ends, truth is often absent. It is then that the media has the narrative they wish to tell, and they will be unwavering in its telling. Witnesses who challenge the narrative will not be shown. There will be no competing ideas unless they are ideas that will still lead to the predetermined point the media wishes it to lead to. The second chance you have often takes place months or years after story. This is when the concerned researching corps globally begins to dig into a story. It used to take years before books could be published. The internet has shortened that to weeks and months. The growing frustration with the police and the FBI already shows us that the witnesses and the public are challenging the official narrative. And what is the official narrative? It's whatever spokespeople say it is. It's always been confusing to me why journalists, supposedly well-trained and seasoned journalists, take spokespeople at face value, and more so, why they print the spokesperson's statement as truth. Truth. As if a spokesperson would never spin a story for some intended purposes or an intended purpose of the agency for which they speak. Midnight Rider News and BRIAN LLOYD are going to stay on the Las Vegas story, and we hope that you will too. The latest and greatest journalistic corps is you, and we're glad to be here with you. I've also been slightly bothered and annoyed with the branding of this aftermath. Hashtag Vegas Strong. See, the word strong has now been attached to a corporatized version of tragedy. It's the new gate, which began with Watergate, and is now attached to every scandal as an easy naming ritual. A ritual we should not forget, which sends a message to your subconscious about the supposed scandal taking place. It's word association. But the thing is, Las Vegas already has its own perfect saying, its perfect motto, and it has for decades. So to everyone currently listening in the great state of Nevada, I want to say, stay open-minded, seek truth, and viva Las Vegas. From the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight, I wish you peace.
The Midnight Rider News Show with St. Patrick is a production of MidnightRiderNews.com. Copyright belongs to St. Patrick and all rights reserved. You can email us at midnightridernews@gmail.com, and be sure to visit MidnightRiderNews.com for the best in alternative historical analysis. This is Leanne saying thank you for listening. Have a great night, and always remember, when life throws you lemons, throw them back and demand chocolate.